The flames danced in the wind, casting flickering shadows over the attentive faces of the warriors gathered around the fire. The skald adjusted his fur cloak and, with an enigmatic gaze, began to chant the words that had spanned the ages. Listen, sons of the north, for this is the saga of Sigurd the Reborn, whose fury defied death itself. The storm raged on the night Sigurd fell. Betrayed by those he trusted, he felt the cold blade pierce his back, his blood mixing with the war-soaked earth. But death was not his end, only his beginning. He opened his eyes in Helheim, where the wind was a whisper of lamentations and the shadows dragged like restless souls. The ground was cold as the promise of oblivion, and the dead marched aimlessly, prisoners of their own existence. But Sigurd would not accept his fate, not without revenge. Then he heard the call, an echo deep in the caverns of the afterlife. Following the voice, he found what few dared face, a black dragon with flaming eyes, bound by the chains of the underworld itself. The creature offered him a deal whispered in the darkness, the power to return to the world of the living. But every gift has its price, and Sigurd accepted. He felt the fire of the creature burning his soul, molding his body back to flesh, but something inside him shattered. When he awoke in the world of the living, vengeance burned in his chest like the fury of a fallen god. Yet the days turned into nightmares, and the shadow of the dragon whispered in his ear, demanding payment. The question no one dared answer was, what did he have to give in return? In a time when the north winds blew tales of great kings and immortal battles, Sigurd was born, son of Thorald the Iron Shield and Estrid the Wind Keeper. He came into the world on a stormy night, when thunder roared over the fjords and the gods seemed to be waging their own wars in the sky. The midwives whispered omens as they watched him take his first breath. This boy will have a destiny carved in iron and blood. In his village of Skarsgård, a fortress nestled between mountains and the raging sea, he grew up among warriors and hunters, learning early on that strength without wisdom was like a blunt axe, brutal but ineffective. Skarsgård was a home forged in ice and glory, a place where every man and woman bore the weight of history on their shoulders. Its inhabitants were not mere farmers or fishermen, but guardians of a land that did not forgive the weak. Each winter, they faced storms that destroyed crops and drove the weak into hell's cold embrace. But those who endured became part of something greater, an indomitable people whose names would echo throughout the sagas of the Skalds. Sigurd was shaped by this harsh world, learning to wield a sword before he could even write his own name. He was not just a warrior, he was a leader in the making, someone who, from an early age, showed a keen eye and a tireless heart. Sigurd became a defender of his people, a warrior whose name brought security to his allies and fear to his enemies. He was known for his unwavering loyalty, always putting his village above any personal desires. He hunted in the mountains to feed the hungry, built walls against invaders, and fought alongside his brothers with a ferocity that seemed to echo the fury of the gods themselves. His axe, inherited from his father, was his symbol of power, and his word was as sharp as his blade. But in times of greatness, envy grows like weeds in the shade, and the eyes that once admired him soon began to covet what was his. Sigurd grew up not just as a man of Skarsgård, but as a warrior whose name pierced the winds of the north. From his youth, he distinguished himself on the battlefield, fighting alongside the greatest warriors in the kingdom of Nordgard. Wielding his double-bladed axe, forged by the royal blacksmith himself, he became the spearhead in campaigns against invaders and rival tribes. His gaze, always as cold as the ice that covered the mountains, was feared by enemies and allies alike. He fought not only for victory, but for balance, for honor, and for the blood of his ancestors that echoed in his veins. His body was marked by scars, each telling a story, each remembering a fallen enemy or a battle won. The army to which he belonged, known as the Wolves of Aegir, was the most feared force in Nordgard. Led by Jarl Ulfric, a man of insatiable ambition and dangerous cunning, the wolves marched across the lands like a rising tide, relentless and lethal. They were warriors trained in the art of war, moving as one beast, destroying armies that dared challenge their rule. Sigurd was the most powerful among them, respected and followed as a leader, even without an official title. His skill in combat was legendary. It was said that when he advanced, Odin himself would stoop to watch. But a man who shines too brightly in the ranks of another can become a threat to the wrong eyes. Sigurd's brilliance began to sting. His loyalty was unquestionable, but his presence was too strong, his name too celebrated, and his popularity grew even among those who swore fealty to Jarl Ulfric. Already the skalds began to sing songs about Sigurd, extolling him not only as a warrior, but as a leader. The word king began to be whispered in the mead halls, and that was enough to plant the seed of betrayal. Ulfric was a proud and suspicious man, and for him, the mere possibility of losing his power was reason enough to act before it was too late. But the blade of betrayal never comes from the front. It lurks in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to pierce the heart. The day Sigurd's loyalty was tainted by the poison of betrayal dawned calmly, with a pale sky over the lands of Nordgard. Winter was in full swing, and a bitter wind blew through the frost-covered pines. The Wolves of Aegir had returned from a victorious campaign against the southern clans, and the village celebrated their conquest. Mead flowed from drinking horns, bards sang of warriors' deeds, and the flames of the fires painted dancing shadows on the walls of Ulfric's great hall. Sigurd, as always, kept himself out of the drunkenness, choosing instead to observe. He never let his guard down, even in times of peace. But tonight, peace was an illusion forged by treacherous hands. Ulfric had planned everything. He knew that facing Sigurd in open battle would be suicide, for the warrior had already bested every man in his army. So the betrayal came not with steel, but with cunning. During the banquet, Ulfric stood up and toasted Sigurd, praising his bravery before everyone. With words laced with false admiration, he handed him a silver goblet filled with poison-laced mead. The liquid flowed golden in the torchlight, and Sigurd hesitated for a moment. His instincts screamed, but the entire hall was watching him, and to refuse a toast from their jarl would be an insult. He raised the goblet to his lips. The poison would not kill instantly. It would only dull his senses, making him slow and vulnerable, enough so that he would not be able to fight when the real blow came. And it did. As the poison began to weigh heavily on his body, Sigurd felt the world around him distort. His vision blurred, his limbs lost strength. It was then that Ulfric's warriors advanced. Like jackals on a wounded lion, they surrounded him, swords drawn. Sigurd tried to fight back, but his muscles wouldn't budge. The jarl watched from afar, a satisfied smile on his face. The great warrior who had inspired song and admiration was now on his knees, defenseless. Blows came from all sides, blades ripping through flesh, spears piercing his armor. He roared, not in pain but in fury, his spirit refusing to yield. But even the strongest fall before betrayal. And so, under the cold glow of the moon, Sigurd fell, unaware that his journey had only just begun. The cold in Helheim was not just physical. It seeped into the bones, the soul, the very spirit of those who resided there. Sigurd did not know how long he had been there. Time, after all, was not a constant in that dark realm. When he opened his eyes after his death, everything around him was a dense, icy fog that moved like silent specters around him. The ground was made of slippery black stone, covered in a thin layer of cracked ice. The sky, if it could be called that, was a gray-green expanse, without sun, moon, or stars, only the diffuse light of a world that seemed suspended between existence and nothingness. Sigurd wondered for a time he could not measure. He walked among hunched figures, souls that murmured meaningless words, condemned to wander aimlessly through the underworld. Some looked up at him, but their eyes were empty, dead for centuries or millennia. Among them were warriors, men and women who, like him, had fallen in battle. But if Valhalla was the destiny of the victorious, Helheim was the burden of the forgotten. Sigurd would not accept that. He could not accept it. His death was not honorable, not a death worthy of a warrior. The icy wind howled like a hungry wolf, whipping at his skin, biting into his flesh like invisible teeth. He staggered, his bare feet dragging on the sharp ground, where brittle bones cracked with each step. There were rivers of dark ice, where shadows could be seen riding beneath the surface, as if trying to emerge and escape. Dry, crooked trees rose from nowhere, their roots like claws clenched in the frozen ground. Sometimes one of them whispered his name, as if the underworld itself mocked his presence. He screamed, a roar of rage, pain, and fury, but the sound was swallowed up by the silent immensity. Here, no one listened. Or worse, someone listened, but did not care. Hel, the ruler of this domain, was not like Odin or Thor, who marched alongside their warriors. She was a distant shadow, a presence that permeated everything but offered no answers. Revolt grew within him. Sigurd knelt in the black snow, clenched his fists, and pounded the ground furiously. "This cannot be my fate," he roared, his voice echoing in the void. "My blood was spilled for treason. I should not be here." But Helheim offered no answers, only silence and cold. Then something changed. Up ahead, beyond the creeping shadows, beyond the hopeless souls, Sigurd saw something unusual. A dark crevice, a cavernous mouth carved into a mountain of ice and black rock. The air there seemed to vibrate with a strange heat, something that did not belong in this world of eternal cold. He stood up, muscles protesting, and headed toward the darkness of the cave. If Helheim wouldn't give him a way out, he would find one on his own. Sigurd stepped into the cave, feeling the darkness engulf his vision. The heat emanating from within was dense and stifling, a sensation that contrasted with the biting cold that dominated Helheim. He moved cautiously, the echoes of his footsteps reverberating off the rocky walls, until finally, a faint light appeared in front of him, weak and pulsing, as if the air itself were charged with energy. The smell that emanated from within the cave was strange, a mixture of sulfur and something deeper, as if the weight of eternity itself had infiltrated it. The cave seemed alive, breathing with an energy that made Sigurd feel as if he were crossing a border between worlds. The walls were covered in runes, ancient and powerful symbols that seemed to glow golden, but only became visible as he approached. Each step he took seemed to take him deeper into a veil of mystery, as if the cave were not simply a refuge, but a passage, a bridge between Helheim and the realms beyond. Soon, he came to a vast chamber, where space opened up as vast and endless as the abyss itself. And there, in the center of the cave, stood the dragon. It seemed no ordinary creature, but an entity that transcended the limits of time and space. Its scales were an opaque black, as if they were made of the very darkness that filled the cave. The dragon was immersed in a deep fire, the flames of which did not burn, but instead rippled in shades of green and blue, as if the fire were a reflection of the very souls that had passed through it. Sigurd shivered, not in fear, but in a deep recognition, as if its presence had been ingrained in his mind even before he entered the cave. The dragon did not look at him immediately, but it knew he was there. The silence was palpable, But the creature's power was so great that the absence of words became an unbearable weight. Sigurd felt a pressure, as if the very walls of the cave were watching him, waiting for a response. Then, a deep, powerful voice, like the rumble of distant thunder, filled the cavern. It was no ordinary speech, but an impression that came from within his own mind. "Sigurd, the warrior who calls for vengeance," the dragon said, its voice echoing off the cavern walls. "You have come here for a reason. You are not the first, nor will you be the last. Many have tried to escape the chains of Helheim, but have failed. What makes you different?" Sigurd stared at the dragon, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing around the creature. He could not deny the power he felt emanating from its presence. The dragon was no mere beast of flesh and blood. It was something much deeper, more ancient, that crawled through the confines of time. "I have been betrayed," Sigurd said firmly, his voice stronger than he had anticipated. "Dying is not the end of a warrior. The battle is not yet over. I seek to return to the world of the living to exact my revenge. To right the wrong." The dragon tilted its head, as if considering his words. For a moment, Sigurd thought he might be on trial, but then the dragon spoke again, its voice filled with a sinister, seductive tone. "I can grant you what you wish. I can return you to the world of the living. I can make your revenge a reality." Sigurd took a step forward, the promise of returning to the world he knew making his heart beat faster. But the dragon took his time. He continued, his voice now filled with a weight that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "But," the dragon continued, "there is a price to be paid. What you desire is not free. To return it, you must give up something that is worth more than any gold or power you possessed in life. You must give up your heart." Sigurd froze. He didn't understand right away. What did that mean? His heart was what defined him as a warrior, as a man, as a living being. Without it, what would be left of Sigurd? It was an unthinkable sacrifice, something that could not be fully understood. He felt a sudden pain in his chest, as if the very emptiness of Helheim had seeped into his being. But he did not hesitate. Vengeance coursed through his veins, a flame that burned brighter than anything he had ever known. "I need nothing more. Only my vengeance. What is the heart compared to that?" Sigurd said, the decision already formed in his mind. "I accept." The dragon smiled. If such an imposing creature could smile, then it is done. I will grant you the power to return. But remember, Sigurd, once your heart is given, you will be forever bound to me. You will be mine, and I will be yours. What you do in life will be a reflection of what you have lost. Your destiny will be intertwined with mine." Sigurd nodded, not in fear, but with fierce determination. He knew there was no turning back. His journey of vengeance had begun, and nothing, not even death itself, could stop him now. The dragon extended its imposing claws, touching Sigurd's chest, and in that moment, he felt a deep pain, as if his very being was being ripped away. When the dragon's claws withdrew, Sigurd was no longer the same man. His heart had been ripped out, but his soul burned brighter than ever. He was ready to return, to take justice into his own hands. His destiny was no longer that of a simple warrior, but that of a man who had accepted the darkness in his heart in exchange for what he desired most. The dragon, now guardian of his spirit, whispered in his mind, "Now, go. The world of the living awaits you. But always remember, warrior, revenge is not a path of no return." Sigurd, with the fury of 1,000 battles within him, prepared to leave Helheim behind, willing to pay whatever price was necessary, for a single purpose, revenge. Sigurd emerged from the depths of the underworld like a shadow. The ground of Midgard seemed different now. so simple and mundane in the face of the strength he felt within him. The sky, previously gray and distant, seemed closer, more tangible, but at the same time heavy with a haze that would not dissipate. It was as if the world itself was tense, waiting for the impact of his arrival. His appearance had irrevocably changed. His body, though still robust and muscular as in his previous life, now seemed to carry a denser, heavier presence. Sigvard's skin had taken on a pale, cold tone, as if he was something between the living and the dead. The mark of the pact with the dragon was visible on his chest, a deep scar that radiated a dark energy. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a constant reminder of the price he had paid to return. The veins in his body, now visible beneath his skin, were tinged with a black and blue color, as if the poison of death was circulating instead of blood. But his eyes had changed more than any other part of his body. They were deep and dark, like bottomless wells, carrying the weight of an existence that had transcended death. There was no longer the flame of life in them, but a cold, relentless intensity. When Sigvard looked at something, it was as if he could see beyond it, penetrating the deepest layers of the soul, as if there was no longer anything that could deceive him. His strength was now unmatched. With every step he took, the ground seemed to give way, as if the earth itself was shaking under his weight. The battles he had fought in his previous life were nothing compared to the strength he possessed now. Every muscle in his body pulsed with raw power, a power that was not human. His body was not just stronger, it was transformed. He felt as if he could rip trees from the ground with a single hand, crush rocks as if they were nothing more than dust. His agility had also increased. Sigvard moved with the speed of a shadow, almost impossible to follow, as if darkness itself enveloped him. Sigvard's senses were sharper than ever. He could hear the sound of a falling leaf from miles away, feel the vibrations of the air around him, as if he were part of the world. He could detect the slightest movement, the subtlest of smells. But most impressive of all was the connection with the dragon that still burned within him. He felt the power of the dragon in every cell of his body, a presence that could not be ignored, and at the same time, a voice whispered in his mind. Sometimes it seemed as if the dragon was watching his every step, waiting to see how far Sigvard would go. And most interesting of all, Sigvard felt an insatiable hunger, a desire that could not be satisfied. He didn't know if it was the desire for revenge that consumed him or if something else had awakened within him, but he knew he couldn't stop until his mission was accomplished. The thirst for revenge was rooted in his being in a way that could not be erased. And although he had the power to destroy everything around him, he knew he had to be patient. He needed something more. He needed the right opportunity, the right scene for his revenge to be accomplished. Sigvard looked around, observing the landscape of Midgard, now so familiar and so distant at the same time. He felt a connection with the land, with the winds that cut through the forests, with the sea that crashed against the rocks. But that wasn't enough for him. What he sought, what he felt as a vital need, was the death of those who betrayed him. And for that, he needed more than power. He needed a plan. He needed to get closer, slowly and meticulously. There were many in his path, and he knew that to achieve his goal he would have to be clever, calculating, and wait for the right moment to strike. He walked to the edge of the Jarl's village. He didn't get close enough to be seen, but close enough to feel the presence of his former companions. The village seemed peaceful, as if nothing had happened, as if the land was still as calm as when Sigvard had left, as if time had not moved on. But for him, time had stopped. His life, his emotions, his very destiny were all intertwined with that moment. Nothing else mattered but his revenge. Sigvard crouched down and, with a firm hand, touched the ground beneath his feet. He could feel the vibrations of the earth, the movements of the village and the hearts of the men who lived there. He knew that at any moment he could destroy everything around him, but he held himself back. His goal had not yet been achieved. He looked at the village with piercing eyes, calculating every movement, every breath, waiting for the right moment. He knew that his revenge would be inevitable, but he also knew that patience was his greatest ally. The time he spent observing, the time he spent preparing, would make his blow more devastating. And so he waited, on the threshold of the village, waiting for the moment when his revenge would finally become reality. But for now, he remained in the shadows, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The inner war that burned in his chest would not find rest until the last breath of his enemies was taken, but he knew that the time to strike had not yet come. The village of Helheim was quiet, a peaceful spot in the vast Midgard countryside. Wooden and stone houses lined the muddy streets, the smell of food still wafting through the air. There was no indication that death was about to break out like a relentless storm. Sigurd approached from the shadows, his body moving with the precision and power of a predator stalking its prey. He was now something beyond humanity, an entity that transcended mortal limitations. Every step he took shook the ground as if the earth were his ally. He was no longer the man who had fallen in battle, but an agent of destruction, a force of nature. Sigurd climbed up the hills, skirting the village walls, his heightened senses picking up even the slightest sound of life moving within. He could hear the whispers of the sentries, the chatter of the guards in the towers, the heartbeats of the villagers. But most important of all was the Jarl. Sigurd could feel the presence of his leader wherever he was. The Jarl stood in the center of the village, surrounded by those who still called themselves his warriors. But Sigurd knew that he was no longer the leader he remembered. There was something empty in him, something that the death of the warrior had filled with an insatiable desire for revenge. The wind cut through the night with a deadly softness, like a silent warning that death was already approaching. Sigurd positioned himself at the entrance to the village, peering through the darkness. He knew he had to be quick, lethal, and merciless. His eyes glowed with an unearthly glow. And then he moved. Like a shadow, he glided through the streets of the village, avoiding the patrols with superhuman agility, his steps silent and quick, like a ghost crossing the scene of his revenge. When he finally reached the center of the village, where the Jarl stood, Sigurd stopped for a moment, his eyes fixed on the place where it had all begun, where he had been betrayed. The Jarl, sitting on his stone throne, seemed calm, surrounded by a few of his warriors. Sigurd could hear their carefree laughter, as if nothing had happened. They did not know. They did not know that death had returned, that Helheim's own winter was coming to claim their souls. Sigurd leapt into the center of the square, his presence an explosion of strength and rage. The first of the guards tried to raise his sword, but before he could make a move, Sigurd advanced like a lightning bolt. With a single blow, the warrior was thrown backwards. His sword snapped in half and his body fell limply to the ground. The sound of his fall echoed across the deserted square. The Jarl stood, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and anger. He immediately recognized the figure that loomed before him, a shadow from the past. The man he had betrayed, now returned from the dead. Fear was instantaneous. Sigurd advanced, and the battle began. The Jarl, in his desperate attempt to defend himself, drew his sword, a broad battle-axe that gleamed in the moonlight. But Sigurd was no longer in the realm of mortality. His blows were swift and unstoppable, as if he were a storm, each movement a wave of relentless destruction. With a scream of rage, the Jarl attacked, his axe cutting through the air with force. But Sigurd dodged with supernatural agility, as if he knew exactly what the Jarl was going to do before he made it. With a strength that came from beyond, Sigurd struck a blow that knocked the Jarl's axe from his hand and threw it far away. The Jarl took a step back, surprised by the strength of his enemy, but not for long. Sigurd gave him no time to breathe. In a single fluid movement, he advanced, striking the Jarl in the ribs with his sword. The Jarl staggered, trying to keep his ground, but his body was already being consumed by pain. The Jarl's army tried to fight back, but Sigurd decimated them one by one. He moved among them like a furious shadow, his sword slashing, crushing, breaking everything in its path. Each blow was a death sentence. The sound of swords and bodies falling to the ground echoed like a symphony of destruction. None of the Jarl's warriors stood a chance. Sigurd was beyond death, beyond pain, beyond fear. He was immersed in a hatred that made him unstoppable. Finally, only Sigurd and the Jarl remained. The leader, now without his sword and bleeding profusely, crawled to the back of the square. He knew his death was imminent, but still he tried to get up, trying to grab a spear from the ground nearby. But Sigurd gave him no chance. He approached calmly, watching the Jarl with cold eyes, as if he were looking at a creature that had served its purpose and was now being discarded. With a final blow, Sigurd slit the Jarl's throat, his blood spurting onto the ground. The man who had once been a mighty leader was now dead, his last breath swallowed by the darkness. Sigurd stood, watching the Jarl's death as vengeance was fulfilled, an echo of justice that resounded through time. He felt the sense of victory, but at the same time, there was a growing emptiness within him. The price of his revenge still haunted him, and the promise he had made to the dragon in Helheim still weighed heavily upon his shoulders. He turned and left the village behind, his body moving with the same speed and precision with which he had arrived. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of destruction and the suffering of those who had survived his wrath. Sigurd had fulfilled his promise, but he sensed that his journey was far from over. His destiny called him back to Helheim, to find the dragon, to fulfill the last piece of his pact. He knew that the price of his revenge was yet to come, and that the true pain was only just beginning. Sigurd returned to the darkness that awaited him, his mind dark and his heart heavy. The dragon waited, like an eternal shadow, ready to claim what was due him. Sigurd, his revenge accomplished, returned to Helheim, his steps heavy, his gaze dark. The dragon awaited him, its enormous figure illuminated by an unearthly glow. The price of his journey was now clear. His soul was bound to that ancient and powerful creature, a being that traveled between worlds. Sigurd, now marked forever, became the dragon's servant, an eternal soldier, condemned to live in the darkness he had sought with such fervor. The dragon looked at him with eyes like abysses and spoke, his voice echoing throughout Helheim. You sought revenge, warrior, but in your thirst, you lost what you could never have regained. Sigurd, his soul already weakened and filled with emptiness, now became part of the shadow, a slave to a greater destiny that he himself had chosen. His revenge was accomplished, but the price was more than he had imagined. There was no joy in the end, only a deep loneliness, an empty echo of his own quest. Revenge did not bring the peace he had imagined. The story finally came to an end. The skald who told it looked at the fire, the heat of its flames reflecting off the shadows that danced around it. He picked up a piece of wood and extinguished the flames with a simple gesture. The fire died down, leaving behind only ashes and a cold night. Let each of us seek our own destiny, the skald murmured. But remember, not all revenge brings the peace one seeks. And with a sigh, he stepped away from the dying fire, leaving behind the memories of what once was, as darkness filled the space around him. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.